Well, hey everybody, I hope you can hear me okay. And we're here to begin our new study of the book of Luke. I'm going to pull up Facebook here just to see your comments as we are broadcasting. Yes, so I see already some questions. Linda Cronell asked if we had started or not, and the broadcast always begins with a little bit of a grace period as people figure out how to log in and get online.
Everybody, I hope you can hear me okay. And we're here to begin.
See, that was already one technical difficulty. As I was watching the live feed just to make sure everything was progressing smoothly, the audio of my computer was still on. So, always with these new classes, and as we begin teaching again, and as you all come back to class and figure out how to log in, there may be some newcomers here today, some folks who just had trouble finding the feed or all that. So that's why we just put that screen up there to give people time to find it. So as I look, I can see there's 21 people here already, so glad you're here with us. Just checking also the comments to see if there are any technical issues, but I don't see anybody saying that they can't see or they can't hear, so it looks like we're all good. But welcome Melanie, Anna Kay, Jennifer, Linda, Gail, Joanne, Susan, Sue Townsend, Ann Cooper, Kathy Talbert, everybody else who's joining in. Glad you all are here. So we begin today with the Gospel of Luke, and I could not be more excited to do that. I'm going to go through some basic information about the class, what you can expect and how you can participate, and then we will just take a tiny peek at Luke's own introduction to the text, and we'll be off and running. I want to begin with a word of prayer, so wherever you are, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Dear God, help us as we seek to study your word. Guide our reading and our thinking and our questions, and speak to us, as always, through the text. We pray for this class that over the next few months it would be a way that we draw closer to you, and that the person and work of Jesus Christ, your Son, becomes ever more real to us. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, class basics. And this will be basic for those of you that have done this before, but again, we always have some new people joining, so want to make sure you know what you need for the class. You need this enormous book, Introduction to the New Testament. No, I'm kidding. You don't need that. You do need, though, a Bible. And you can use whatever translation you want. I always tell people when they ask me, what translation Bible should I get? Which one should I read? I say, read the one you already have. If you've got one, just read it. Unless that one is difficult for you to understand. But if you want to be particular at it, if you are the kind of person that does whatever the teacher says, I will let you know that I use the ESV, English Standard Version. Like any English translation of the Bible, it is not perfect, and there are some choices that the translator made that I might have made differently, but it's a text that I think does a really good job of staying faithful to the original Hebrew, and in our case the Greek of Luke's Gospel. And also I use the ESV because the study notes in the ESV Study Bible are really, really helpful. Some of the best I've seen. And since those are not inspired directly by the Holy Spirit, but are just written by scholars, if you get the ESV Study Bible, you don't have to agree with everything in the study notes. I don't either. But in terms of getting the history, the context, the geography, the culture, all those notes in it are really, really helpful. So the ESV Study Bible is what I use. All right, so you need a Bible. I think it's also really good to have paper and pen, just writing implements, a journal, a notebook, something, so that as you read the text, you can jot down questions or thoughts, and as we go through the lesson, if there's stuff that really sticks out to you, or some highlights or things you want to investigate further, you can always write those things down. There is no homework for this class. You can show up in the middle. You can show up even if you've missed some lessons, and you won't be excluded, and you can always participate. So If you do want to prepare, there are some that really enjoy preparation for class. Next week, we'll really start digging in. Today's class is just kind of an introduction. But if you want to do something sort of fun and interesting, I would encourage you to read the Gospel of Luke in one sitting. Most of us are used to hearing the Bible read in church, where you get just a chunk of a chapter, maybe 10, 12 verses. And maybe some of you have a good Bible study discipline at home, and you read maybe a chapter at a time. Maybe if you get crazy, 2 chapters. But these books were meant to be read as a whole, and they could, in the amount of time that you would spend going to a movie and watching a movie in the theater, or now at home, you could read the full Gospel of Luke. And it's a vastly different experience to read it from beginning to end. So it's an interesting exercise. If you want to try it, that's a good way to get into the text, and that way you have kind of the whole framework in your head. And if you do that, and you have questions as you do that, again, keep your paper and pen at your side and make some notes as you do that, questions and things that come up for you. So those are kind of just some basics about the class. A few more little pieces to keep in mind. If you want to reach out to me, you can always do that by writing me at aaron@stalmanswaco.org. If you have theological questions, also, by the way, if you want to introduce yourself to me, if you're a new person in the class, I'd love to get to know a little bit about you, since we can't do this in person right now. If you have questions about scheduling or technical issues or anything like that, kind of the practical stuff, you can write to Hillary Gardner at hillary@stalmanswaco.org. She's our parish administrator and works behind the scenes, a lot of the nuts and bolts about the class. And if you want to get emails about the class, you'll want to be on Hillary's list. So those are the people to contact. Again, theology and Bible, write to me. Practical details related to calendar and technology, write to Hillary, and we can get you the answers that you need, or at least we'll try. I want to reiterate again that even though this is a Bible study provided by St. Alban's Episcopal Church, you are welcome regardless of your denominational or theological or church background, or if you have no church background at all. We try to approach the text with fresh eyes and come at it from the same place, and I really want to make sure it's accessible to everybody. How to view it? Well, if you're viewing it, you know that you can see this on either Facebook Live or on YouTube. And after the live stream has ended, everything will be recorded and available on Facebook or YouTube. In terms of video and audio quality, I find that the recorded versions on Facebook on YouTube tend to be a little bit higher quality, but you can watch it either place. So, which is a new feature, so something to be thankful for thanks to the coronavirus. Previously, these were in person, and we recorded the audio, which wasn't always accessible, but now we have not only audio, we have video as well, and it'll be online for you after the broadcast. So, some of you, just getting, again, some of the housekeeping and nuts and bolts details out of the way, some of you have asked when we will begin meeting together in person. And, based on guidelines from the federal government, state government, and local government, as well as talking to epidemiologists who are way more educated in this, although you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know how germs spread, we will start meeting together after the positivity rate of coronavirus in McLennan County drops below 5%. Above that, it gets very risky to have people together in one space for a long time. Some of you may say, well, but aren't kids going back to school, and isn't Baylor in session? Yes, and you're seeing lots of coronavirus cases, or you will shortly. And some of you say, well, I go to H-E-B or whatever grocery store you prefer. To which I say yes, and you are moving around constantly in that environment, which is a huge space, which has a massive air moving and air handling system, and you are, in general, not in there as long. What increases the risk of spread is being in one place for an extended period of time with multiple people, even with social distancing, which is what we would have if we were indoors for this Bible study. And so since I live in a home with people who are at high risk, and maybe you are at high risk, and maybe you know people who are at high risk, we are not going to take that risk. Some people, I hear some people say, well, if it's my time to go, it's my time to go. And I think, is that the attitude you have when you encounter a rattlesnake? Do you just stick your hand in its face and wave it around and say, it's my time to go? No, you don't, because you know that venom is dangerous, as is the coronavirus. So we are not going to grab the rattlesnake or play around it. We're going to take it seriously, and we will begin meeting together again once the positivity rate falls below 5%, and we're not there yet. We were close to 10% around the beginning of August, middle of August, and now, of course, we're going back up as school starts and more people are just together for longer periods of time in enclosed spaces. So that's where we are on that. I will say, though, we do have an opportunity if you want to gather with fellow St. Albans people as well as just fellow Christians. We have outdoor services of Holy Communion every Wednesday at 8 a.m. and noon. I already did that today. I celebrated Holy Communion at 8 a.m. this morning, and it was wonderful, and we will have that service again at noon, and you're always invited to join us for that. One more little thing I'll ask you to do is, if you want to always get a notification when we are live streaming this Bible study, at least if you're on Facebook and you follow St. Albans, you'll get that notification. But on YouTube, if you go on and subscribe to our YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and search St. Albans Waco, and this channel will come up, and if you hit that red subscribe button, whenever we go live for this or any event, you will get a notification about that, and you will never miss a Bible study broadcast if you take advantage of that feature. All right, so I believe that covers all of our basics of what we're doing in this class, and in terms of the housekeeping stuff. So just a little bit about the class itself. I've called this Hope for the Hungry, Humble, and Helpless, because that is largely the focus of the Gospel of Luke. It begins, of course, with an account of Jesus' birth, and the mother of Christ, Saint Mary, says, you have filled the hungry with good things. And you have remembered your servant Israel, who's portrayed as this kind of in a helpless position. And it says that you've looked on the lowliness of your handmaiden, or the humility of your handmaiden. So this hungry, humble, and helpless, kind of a lot of that comes from the Magnificat, those prayers, that song of praise and prayer that St. Mary says when she finds that she's carrying the Christ child, and that's kind of one of the first scenes you get in the Gospel of Luke. So that's where it comes from, but that gives us the theme for the whole thing. So you'll see this develop over time. This mosaic, by the way, from a church in England, shows the evangelist, St. Luke, the writer of the Gospel of Luke, there writing his text. You can see above his head is an oxen, and that's the four evangelists are often compared or connected with the four creatures shown in Ezekiel. Something looks like a person or a man, an eagle, an oxen, and a lion. And Luke is often connected with the oxen. So that's what that is. I'm pretty sure that's not exactly what Luke looked like, but that gives us just a nice image there to begin the text. So here we are. I want to today spend some time. Now we're getting into it. Now we're going to talk about the Gospel of Luke, and to do that, I need to get into the context, the history, and the culture of the time, because that's really going to help us understand more of what's happening. These books of the Bible, especially the New Testament Gospels in particular, were written in a historical context in time to people in a historical context in time, and the more you understand that, the better. If you were to pick up the Gettysburg Address and you didn't know anything about the Civil War or who Abraham Lincoln was, it would be harder to understand what was going on in that text. And so same way for the gospel. And these are books that were specifically written with, they'll talk about who was in political power at the time. They will name geographical locations. All this stuff actually exists. And so the more we know about it, the more we can really understand what's going on. So that's what we're going to give you some background on today. So just checking the comments, seeing if there's anything. Nope, everybody's good. Welcome, Tommy. Good to see you here. Okay. So, why study the Gospel of Luke? Well, we just finished the the book of Acts, and that is volume 2 of the works of St. Luke. Luke wrote Luke first and then Acts, and it was a 2-volume set. And so since we did volume 2, it seemed good to me, to quote St. Luke, to do volume 1 as well. And it's been 2 years since this Bible study has gone through a gospel. We did the book of Romans, so we did Matthew back in 2018, and then we did the book of Romans, and then we did the book of Acts, which was just finished. So it's always good to come back to the life and person of Jesus. So that's why we're doing Luke. It's got some wonderful qualities to it. It's beautifully written. Luke's command of the Greek language is unparalleled in the New Testament, and you get the sense that he had a real literary mind, that he was just really good with putting words and phrases together in a compelling way. It's fun to read. It's beautifully written. And, of course, you get to see and be near and feel like you're present with Jesus. Which brings me now to sort of the composition of this book. So, who was Luke? When was it written? So, he's known as St. Luke the Evangelist. Doesn't mean that he was walking around with Bibles on street corners. Evangelist means he was a gospel writer. St. Luke the Evangelist, the writer of this gospel, this evangel, this good news. He was a physician. He was a friend of St. Paul. You know that from the book of Acts when we read, and many times Luke, as the one writing it, would say, we then went to this place, or we then did that thing, because Luke was traveling with St. Paul. And St. Paul does actually refer to Luke in his own writings as well. Colossians 4:14 says, Luke, the beloved physician, or as some translations have it, my dear friend Luke. So this was somebody who Paul knew and knew well. He was a physician, meaning he was educated. He would have been in kind of the upper middle class. And in a time when not everybody was literate and not everybody was educated, and there wasn't public education like we have now, he came from obviously a family of some means. You will see scholars have some different opinions about when Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke. It was in either the early 60s AD, so about 30 years after the death of Jesus, possibly in the 70s or 80s AD. Again, he was a contemporary of St. Paul, and that's about the time that Paul was writing. So you've had now 30 to 50 years since the death of Christ for this movement to begin to spread, and it goes from a movement that after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus believes that he'll return very, very quickly, and then and so they don't really take the time to write anything down. They tell the stories, and there's an oral tradition, but as it takes a little bit longer and they realize that his return is not imminent, at least in a human chronology, they begin to write some of these stories down to assist them in passing the knowledge on to the subsequent generation of believers. And Luke comes in that category. So you'll get the sense that Luke, as far as we can tell, was not necessarily an eyewitness himself of Jesus' life and ministry. He may have. It's possible that he was alive and knew of the events, but again, we can't be totally sure. What we'll see later on as we look at just Luke's introduction to the text today, he says that he very carefully gathered his data from eyewitnesses and people that were there at the time. So that's a little bit about Luke, and by the way, we do get the sense that he knows a lot about, obviously he writes Greek, he speaks Greek, he is very much familiar with that tradition. He also is familiar with the Jewish tradition, and in the Gospel of Luke, which seems to be written for a primarily Gentile audience, Luke knows how to explain all the Jewish traditions for that audience and make it sensible to them. So, just a brief thing now on the structure of the book. Basically, 3 big parts. Part 1, in Galilee. So Jesus' ministry around the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. Part 2, Judea and Perea. So Jesus moves south and has ministry in that region. And actually that's most of the book in terms of the numbers of words, numbers of chapters. That's where most of it takes place. And then the last big chunk is the last week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem, the basically Holy Week, the Passion of Christ, his death and resurrection. So those are the three big chunks of the Gospel of Luke, as we'll see as we go through it. If you have questions at any time as we're broadcasting, I have got my eye here on the feed, and if you are confused or have a question or just want to make an observation, feel free to type that, and I'm keeping my eye on that, as well as the YouTube feed. So Facebook seems to be a better venue for kind of those live questions, but I'll try to keep an eye on both things. I am seeing that Donna has joined us on YouTube, as has Kimberly. So welcome, you guys. So thanks for doing that. And again, questions, comments, points of clarification, points of order, whatever. Feel free to type those there in the comment section. By the way, some have asked why we're not doing Zoom. Zoom does allow you to record and to talk to one another and to broadcast it on Facebook. We found that Zoom is great for some things, but it does have kind of a registration process and all that. So we're just going to stick with this for now, and that allows us to get it to Facebook and YouTube very easily and very quickly, and also does have this option for you to ask questions if you got them. All right, take a pause. Do you have questions, thoughts? Write them down. And I will continue with teaching you a little bit about the world of the first century. Again, this is introduction. Verse 5 of chapter 1 of Luke says, "In the days of King Herod of Judea." And maybe you've seen a Christmas pageant or two and you think you know who King Herod is, and maybe you do, but it's good to put ourselves mentally in that space. Who was King Herod? What was going on? What was life like at that time? Because Luke, it's good to remember, is writing at least 90 years after the events that he's about to recount, the beginning of Jesus' life. So this would be for us like saying, in the days of President Herbert Hoover. Now, were you around during Hoover's administration? Do you remember what daily life was like then? Maybe not. And so to get a sense of what Luke is talking about, it's really good for us to do that, to know who Herod is, to know what the time was like. So the major player is, the first he mentions in verse 5, King Herod. Now, who's Herod? Herod is Herod the Great. He was already part of a dynasty, and that dynasty would continue after him. And he had become king in 37 BC, and he was king until 4 BC. So when it begins in the days of King Herod the Great, we know that this is going to be at the end of Herod's life. You know, Jesus was supposed to be born at year 0, but the monks who figured that out in the Middle Ages kind of got it wrong a little bit. So Jesus was born at the end of King Herod's reign, but that was probably either 6, 5, or 4 BC, not quite 0. So Herod was married 5 times. He had lots of kids. After his death, the region that he governed was split up into 4 parts, and some of his sons ruled those parts. He's famous for building the temple. If you go back in the Old Testament, you'll know that the first temple for the Jewish people was built in Jerusalem under the reign of Solomon, King Solomon, which is like thousands of years before this stuff. And so Solomon built the temple, but the temple was destroyed when the Babylonians invaded Israel and knocked the temple to the ground, and everybody went into exile. And so King Herod comes along much later and rebuilds the temple, and it's called the Second Temple. So you'll sometimes hear biblical scholars talk about in the Second Temple period, And that's what that means. Second Temple period means the time just before and after Jesus' ministry, really. Because the Second Temple, Herod is king in 37 BC. During his reign, builds the Second Temple. It now exists when Jesus is born and exists over the course of his life. Jesus dies in the 30s, let's say, in 30s AD. By 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. So the structure, sadly, is only going to last for about 100 years. But that Second Temple period is the time in which Jesus does his ministry, and so it's an extremely important period for world history and for our history as Christians. Herod was, in some ways, a very good ruler, but also an autocratic ruler, a harsh ruler, and you didn't want to cross Herod. One of his enemies, who was one of the high priests at the time, Herod had him drowned in his own palace in Jericho. Herod had palaces all over the region where he lived, and he had this enemy drowned, the high priest. So even if clergy were not exempt from his wrath. One of his wives, who he loved dearly, but he thought she committed adultery. He had her killed, and then by the end of his life, as he was in the later stages of dementia, he would wander the halls calling her name. He was a great builder. The fortress at Masada, Caesarea Maritima, a city on the coast, as well as the temple, of course, itself. Just lots of building projects. There were high taxes during his reign to fund a lot of the stuff, as well as to put money in the pockets of Rome, because Israel was a puppet, or a state, kind of a state that depended on Rome to just exist, basically. Herod was the king of the Jews. He had some sort of kind of Jewish ancestry, not as pure as some people would have liked him to be, and also he was able to cozy up to Rome, which would have meant to some Jews he would have been seen as exceedingly suspect, but he was the king of the Jews, so the descendant, popularly maybe, of King David, although a lot of people didn't like him because of his harshness and his cruelty. It was a police state at that time. You think about stories of Eastern Europe when there were the secret police, and or think about Nazi Germany and the SS, or all this sort of stuff. That was very much a part of life in the first century, in the Second Temple period, because Rome was a state that kept the peace through really strong law and order kind of policies, and they were an empire that had taken over lands of people that didn't want to be taken over by Rome. So the Jewish people in Judea, that was their land that God had given them when God promised it to Abraham in Genesis 12. And that's what they viewed as their homeland. They felt they should be in charge of it, but Rome invaded and took it over and said, sort of like the mafia, this is a great country, it'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. So the Jewish people had to pay money to Rome, which funded the Roman army, which kept the peace, and they got roads, they got engineering, they got some nice architecture out of it, they got connection to global trade routes all around the Mediterranean region, but they also lost some of their autonomy. And so when you have people that are oppressed by an empire, just like in Star Wars, there's always going to be a rebellion. And so there were, every few years, there'd be some Jewish leaders that crop up and would say, hey, we're going to kick out the Romans and take our country back for ourselves. And there were famous revolts, bloody revolts that were often put down violently by the Roman Empire. And so if you know that context, by the way, you know why the Romans get so worried about Jesus. And you know also why the Jews during Jesus' lifetime get so worried about Jesus, because there was this history of these militias, these kind of armed rebellions of coming up from the Jewish peasant class, basically, of people that wanted to kick out the Romans. So when you have this charismatic leader named Jesus show up, people get very nervous, because both the Romans and the Jews. The Romans because they want to keep their power. The Jews because if there's going to be a crackdown on Jewish people because of Jesus, it's going to be a crackdown on all Jewish people. Even if you didn't like Jesus or you were not one of his followers, you would still end up feeling the heavy hand of the Roman authority. And so A lot of people who just like to keep the peace and just don't want to farm my land and not be bothered would have been really worried about Jesus because they would have seen him as stirring up trouble. So that's all kind of about Herod, or not all. That's some of about Herod to give you a background on that, on what that world was like around his time. The emperor in Rome at this time is Tiberius Caesar Augustus. It's just important to know that the Roman emperor at the time, it's hard for us to conceive and understand what that person, what that office would have meant in the world. This was somebody, the president of the United States, which is kind of the supreme ruler that we tend to think of in our context, in our history, was designed specifically by the framers of the Constitution to not be an emperor, right? He's called, and I say he because we've only had a he so far for president, he is called Mr. President, not Your Majesty or Your Excellency or any of these titles that the founding fathers would have known from their European context. Mr. President is a very democratic, small d, meaning for all the people. It's not some divine right monarch who passes on the lineage to his male heir or anything like that. It's just Mr. President. And president just means the one who presides. He's just kind of in charge of the meeting, as it were. And the Constitution expressly prohibits fancy titles, an aristocracy or something like that. So that's our president is elected by the people for a certain period of time, and then that term is over. They're not rulers for life. The president of the United States cannot do whatever he wants. There's a legislature and all that sort of stuff. And yes, there was a Roman Senate and things like that. But just to have a Roman emperor, Caesar, was a completely different beast than what we are used to in our country. And to have the other thing there is that there's a religious cult around Caesar. Caesar was called Pontifex Maximus, High Priest. Caesar was called Son of God. And was seen as a divine being. So for Jesus to come in and call himself King of Kings or Lord of Lords or anything like that is, in that context, a political statement, because the only one that gets to be called King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Son of God is Caesar. So that's kind of another thing, just good to know. All right, how we doing? You guys tracking? Following along? No comments yet, so I guess that means all this is just hitting home and hopefully making sense. Next thing I want to talk about is just the religious life at the time. The world was religiously very diverse in this time period, in the whole Greco-Roman world. We have in this country a worldview that even if you are not a Christian, Christianity kind of informs the basic outlines of how we think about God. Something like 90% of Americans, maybe even a little bit more, believe in God. If you just do a survey, do you believe in God? Yes. And that idea of one God, who's sort of this divine, hopefully benevolent, fatherly figure, that whole perspective comes from Christianity. If you go back to the first century, the idea of sort of one supreme being and a benevolent creator who is wise and made all things and is kind of this maybe a loving being, that is not the perspective in the first century, at least not in the Roman world. And again, the Jewish people were like this tiny, weird sect to most of the wider population. They were in a minority. They had this weird God. They had one God, they said, which was crazy. You couldn't see that God. You couldn't make statues of that God. You couldn't make pictures of that God. It's very different from everybody else. So that's Judaism, this small, weird sect. And then you have everybody else. And everybody else believes in lots of gods, lots of spiritual forces in the world, and they had often a connection to a particular place. you see this in the New Testament when Paul goes to Ephesus and gets in trouble with the religious people there, the Gentiles who were big fans of Artemis, and because they believed that Artemis had come down to Ephesus and all that. So you had region by region different devotion to different deities. And if you read your Greek myths in school, you know about Zeus, and you know about Athena, and you know about Hera, and you know about Vulcan, you know about Mars, the god of war, you know about Apollo, the messenger god, all these different gods, as well as some that you have not heard of that are sort of like more homegrown deities. Cybele was one in the region of Galatia that was an interesting deity. The followers would go around the countryside beating themselves, and the priests were castrated men. So lots of different gods, and the idea was there was no one right god. As long as you gave homage to Caesar, who was seen as a kind of a god on earth, you could believe whatever you want. And there were all these different systems, different ways of believing, and I think that one of the things that you have to understand is these deities were seen as very capricious. Like, don't get them on a bad day. Don't pray to Zeus when he hasn't had his coffee yet. This view of God, sort of slow to anger and patient and long-suffering and always glad to see you and delights in you, and that comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition, not at all in the Greco-Roman tradition, where you have, all the gods coming to earth to have sex, to play games, to create mischief, and if you made them mad, they could make your day really terrible, turn you into an animal or whatever. And so there was this constant practice of sacrificing to these gods so that they don't get mad at you, and you're trying to keep them happy. So this is a religious worldview that would have kind of kept you on kind of pins and needles a little bit. There was a time in the city of Athens, dedicated to Athena, of course, where there was a civil servant, some kind of city magistrate, that was going through the required sacrifices. There were sacrifices required to be offered periodically over the course of the year, again, to keep the gods happy. And he kind of compiled all the different rules and when you were supposed to sacrifice in one place and calculated how much they had done, because they'd sort of missed some of them, they'd forgotten about them, they'd fallen through the cracks, and they wanted to catch up. And he realized that the amount of animals that they would need to sacrifice to kind of get caught up, to get out of, like they were worried about the divine bill collectors calling, like, you owe us 20 goat sacrifices, to get out of that kind of what they owed in terms of back payment. It would have bankrupted the whole city. And there was a lot of nervousness about it because, oh my gosh, we've offended the gods, and what if they do something bad to us? So this is the religious world of the time. The Jewish small sect in the Roman world, and then you have the Greco-Roman religions and all those different deities, which was bloody and capricious and brutal. And it was also a world that very much kind of was a might makes right kind of world. It was not uncommon in Roman culture to abandon newly born infants, just kind of on the trash heap, for whatever reason, because you couldn't care for it or whatever. And there were lots of people who grew up ultimately as slaves because somebody rescued them from the trash heap and brought them into their house and raised them, and they became a servant or a slave or something like that. It was a world that exalted and praised strength and really denigrated displays of weakness. There were statues all over the Roman world of their great generals and gods and things like that. So it was a cruel, harsh world in many ways, and a difficult one to live in, especially if you weren't in the upper classes. The other thing to know is that there were also sects of philosophers. There were many educated people. I mean, you could Just like you can read Plato and Socrates today, you could have also read those guys 2,000 years ago. It was a culture of great art and great literature and great poetry and great philosophy, but there were all these philosophical systems. And I think like an analogy today would be like somebody that gets really into, think about something like Scientology, which isn't quite a religion, but it is kind of a philosophy and a way of life. People that get really into these ideas, like what was contained in The Secret, that really popular book a few years ago about manifesting truths to the universe, and it comes back to you, and visualizing and all that sort of stuff. Like there's not really a God, but there's kind of a philosophy. There was a lot of that. Later, a famous Christian like St. Augustine was a guy who was sort of into that sort of thing, kind of like Plato, but then rejected it, and then Manichaeism. And anyways, there was a lot of that. So a big hodgepodge, mixing pot of religious systems, Jewish folks, Greco-Roman religion, and the philosophies of the day. And often those philosophies required money. You had to pay to get the information. You had to pay to kind of move up the ranks, which is actually true of, for example, Scientology today. So that is the political and religious world of the first century. The final thing I want to talk about is the economic world a little bit, because this comes to be very relevant in Jesus's ministry. The Roman world in Judea, as I mentioned before, was one of high taxes, because to keep the Roman army supplied and the Roman government happy, each one of those states that they controlled, in our case Judea, had to pay large tributes to Rome. The way the local rulers got that, as well as for money for whatever projects they were doing, like King Herod was doing all these building projects, they would tax the people. And the people that collected the taxes were called tax collectors. And Jesus ends up having a lot of work with tax collectors, and they follow him, and he spends time with them. And one of the reasons they were hated so much, tax collectors, is the way the Romans implemented their tax policy was intentionally harsh and corrupt. So the tax collectors would often extort people, because if you didn't pay your taxes, they could send you to prison. And so they would say, hey, you owe me, let's say your tax was $100. They would say, you owe me $150, because they would pay $100 to Rome, and the tax collector would keep $50 for themselves. So there was corruption and extortion. The other thing that was going on is that the tax rates were so high that farmers who were, that's the tax base, this is what people are doing. This is an agrarian society for the most part. And so these folks would mortgage their farms. Often that land had been in their family for centuries. The countryside would have been dotted with these kind of small family farms that had been in their family for centuries. And so the Romans demand this tax. It's too high. You can't pay, because it's not like you have really advanced systems of irrigation or fertilization like we do in modern agriculture. So you're kind of at the whims of the weather. So you have a bad season, and you can't pay the high taxes on your land. So you get a mortgage. You basically get a loan for that from the government. And then when you can't pay back the loan, the government repossesses your land, and now Rome can own all this farmland and can consolidate it into one big giant, kind of like we have now these big farms. They call it big agriculture in the United States. There are very few small family farms anymore. They're usually large, kind of corporate-run agricultural enterprises. And so that's sort of what the Romans were doing. So tax collectors were hated for so many reasons. So the people are there, there's a huge divide, huge wealth gap, kind of inequality and that sort of stuff back in those days, as many parts of our economy in our country. You see some of that today. Just plugging in my computer here so I don't run out of battery. There we go. So it's important to remember that many of the people to whom Jesus was among whom he had his ministry, were people that were under serious financial pressure. The financial anxieties, if anybody listening to this or watching this has financial anxieties, the people that Jesus spoke to and ministered among were very familiar with that situation, often in debt, often living kind of paycheck to paycheck. For them, it was sort of harvest to harvest, just a really hard scrabble existence. So again, his ministry comes to people who are struggling, who are difficult. As I said in the beginning, the name of the class, that this is that Luke is doing his ministry among people that are hungry, humble, and helpless. So that's the context. I know it's a lot. So let me just leave. We're going to end today with just a little taste of the text. We're going to read the first 5 verses here, which goes like this. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So let me put that on the screen for you. Give me a second here. Here you go. So again, just to read through, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So, that text is full of all kinds of stuff. So I want to highlight a couple of things here that we learn immediately just right off the bat. Luke here is writing to somebody named Theophilus. We see this in verse 3. Who is Theophilus? I mean, somebody has written, we say that God's word written is for all of us. Well, here it's specifically for Theophilus. Theophilus is a name meaning someone who loves God, he who loves God. Theos, and then Philos, lover. So you think about the city of Philadelphia, Philos, love, Adelphoi, brothers. So the city of brotherly love, right? Theophilus means lover of God. And who is it? So most excellent, Theophilus, most excellent would be a way you would describe somebody who is prominent, wealthy, important person. Some people think that Theophilus might have been Luke's patron, because unless Luke was continuing to moonlight as a physician, he would have needed space and time to write this work and do the research that led to it. So would have needed somebody to kind of help him pay the bills while he was working on this book. So Theophilus could have been a patron. Theophilus also could have been a made-up person, kind of a generic person that Luke was writing to, kind of dear Christian, sort of, because a lover of God hopefully is everybody who's reading this book. Pause while I get a drink of water. Thank you. So there's some debate about, is Theophilus a real person? Some people think he was actually the publisher of the gospel that underwrote the process of making copies of this, because again, there's no printing press, so each one has to be hand written or hand copied. That's what scribes did, so Some people think that that's who Theophilus was. But again, some people think, well, maybe it was just like a generic person, like Dear Reader, but kind of giving it a nice name for anybody. So that's who it's written to. And you get a lot just from this little introduction, this little dedication to Theophilus. So first, Luke tells us that many have tried to write down an account. Now, isn't that interesting? We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as our Gospels. But it seems like, as Luke says here, there were many people who are writing down accounts. And you maybe have heard of some of these. There's this idea among scholars that there was kind of a source document that Mark, Luke, and John all used that we no longer have, but that there was kind of a collection of sayings or teachings of Jesus. And scholars have named this Q, from the German word for source, Quelle, and so we don't have that document today. There could have been others written, but Luke seems to have felt that some of these other attempts to write down the events of Jesus' life were lacking in some way, because he says, many have tried to take and set down an orderly account, but he says, I too, in verse 3, after investigating everything carefully from the first, decided to write an orderly account for you. So Luke seems to be a real stickler. He says, I investigated everything carefully from the start, like from the beginning of the ministry to the end. I researched, I likely did interviews with people, because many would have still been alive, from the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So he wants to make sure he gets it right. He says, an orderly account. These many different accounts that were circulating at the time, and there's probably a reason why a lot of them don't exist anymore, is because they lacked the thoroughness and the exacting efforts of somebody like St. Luke to kind of pull it all together. So that's one of the first things we see. The other thing is we do get a glimpse into the early collection and transmission of these writings. So Luke says, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So they were handed on to us. This is a reference to that oral tradition. And some people will today are sort of skeptical of an oral tradition. They'll say, what do you mean Luke didn't write this until the 60s or even the 80s AD? That's, 30 to 50 years after Jesus' ministry. Wasn't he just making it all up? People today don't understand the incredible preservative power of the oral tradition and how so often they got it right. One of the places you can see it today is the power to memorize a text and to pass it on orally is in Islam, where children will go to schools to memorize the Quran in Arabic and will be able to recite the entire thing. And in the Jewish tradition, and the tradition that gave rise to Christianity, that was very much alive, this ability to take stories and pass them down and preserve the text. Because, again, for so much of the time in the human history, there wasn't written language, or people couldn't read, even if there was written language, and you needed to find a way to pass these stories on. And so the oral tradition was very powerful, very effective, and incredibly accurate. So, anyways, Luke here says that these stories were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And this eyewitness thing is key for Luke, that he talked to people who actually saw what happened. He went back to the original source, the primary sources, the people that were there, to pull together the information for his gospel. And I think the final thing, and this is what I will leave you with, Luke tells us the point of this gospel. Now, for Theophilus, but also for us. Verse 4, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So, you, watching this Bible study, listening to this, have been instructed in Christianity, and some of you maybe are new to it, but, and Luke wanted his reader to know the truth. And, of course, that's what I want for you, and that's what church should be about, that you would know the truth, and that would be meaningful and helpful for you in your life. And so as we begin this study of the Gospel of Luke, that's my prayer for you, that you would know the truth. So just to kind of recap where we've been today, basics of the class, basics of first century Judea, and the Roman Empire and what Luke was, the context in which Luke was writing, and then just a little taste of the introduction to Luke and who Theophilus was and kind of his motivation in writing and gathering research to create a narrative that is well written, that is thorough, that is orderly, that is investigated, that is researched. Why? So that you could know the truth. That truth is about Jesus. And we're going to get into that next week as we begin with In the Days of King Herod of Judea, where we see God intervening in the world directly with a young peasant girl named Mary, and we'll see what happens from there. So that's all I've got for today. I know it was a lot of me talking. Usually this class is going to be, hopefully, as best we can, a lot more interactive and through the questions and chatting and comment section. And so we'll do that as best we can. Today was just me trying to set the context. So yeah, if you have... So don't get used to just me talking the whole time. Let me pull up the Facebook and YouTube stuff and see again if there are any questions or things to address here. Tommy, you're welcome for putting the text there on the screen. And then I get a thank you also from Joanne. You're welcome, Joanne. Let's see, no questions on the Facebook and none on the YouTube. So I think that'll wrap us up for today. We'll see you next week as we continue in the Gospel of Luke. May God bless you and keep you wherever you are, whatever you're doing, and I'll join you next week as we seek to know the truth. Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.